All right. So today's lecture is going to go a little bit differently. We're going to test this out and see how the sound is because I am going to record as I get the slides finished so that I can upload them so that they're available to you because uploading seems to take the longest amount of time. So just FYI, these are going to be trickling in throughout the day, which means if things look weird and different, that's probably because the videos are happening at different times. Which means that right now is not actually nap time, which is when I usually record. So we could get toddler bombed. You've been warned. So this week we're thinking about syncretism and supersessionism. I traditionally give a lecture. No, that's not correct. I traditionally do an experiential lesson where we talk about early Christianity and its textual history. Not how you're going to see it today. But putting it in a global context, that's kind of a new thing. So I do just want to give you a heads up. I don't know how long it's going to take us to get through this, but I think it's really important stuff. So I'm going to make sure that we get through the basics without it having to go extraordinarily long. So hang in there. It's not going to be equal to 2 classes worth of lectures, but it could run over and be a little bit more than 1. Okay, syncretism and supersessionism. We're going to talk about what those mean. What is the difference between these? And we're going to have a look at a bunch of religions that emerged in the Middle East and South Asia, and we're going to compare those 2 different systems. So we have a clear sense of what is supersession versus what is syncretism. So the traditional form of supersession really mostly applies to the Abrahamic faiths, which are the 3 major monotheisms. But if you'll recall, Judaism was not originally a monotheism. So just reminding ourselves that it was a Canaanite polytheism before 1500 BCE, and then it became a kind of monolatrous religion where there were other gods acknowledged. Some were even worshipped in the temple, but Yahweh was the supreme God. And then after the Babylonian exile, or captivity, that's when Judaism kind of solidified its doctrine, it wrote down its oral traditions, and it made the case for a monotheism. And that allowed them to not acknowledge the legitimacy or truth of the Babylonian god Marduk in favor of the Jewish god Yahweh. So, Jewish monotheism. That goes on for a while. And then along comes Christianity. But Christianity doesn't replace Judaism. It grows out of Judaism. So Judaism continues to go on, and it actually becomes multiple sects, like most religions are. And it continues into the present. And in some traditions, its continuance is very in line with its historical practice. That's what I want to say. Nevertheless, early Christianity is at first a sect of Judaism. Jesus himself is a Jew, and he speaks primarily to other Jews. And after about 90 CE, it starts to appeal more broadly to people outside of Judaism and to spread regardless of whether people were originally Jewish or not. So that's when Christianity takes off. Eventually, and we're going to talk more about this in the next section, but eventually Christianity thinks of itself not as a sect of Judaism, but as the culmination of the Jewish faith. So Judaism, certain branches of it were expecting and or waiting for a Messiah, and then one sect of Judaism comes along and says this one person was the Messiah, and they build a practice around that belief Now, the majority of Jews disagreed and said, no, we don't believe that person was the Messiah. We reject the principles of faith that are built on that assumption, and we continue to practice our traditional faith. And then the ones who did believe that occurrence or that person was the prophesied Jewish Messiah, they took up their own practices and traditions, which changed substantially from the practice of Judaism, and it became its own religion. What's important here is that Christianity sees itself as the inheritor of the Jewish tradition, which means that they don't do a good job of existing alongside Judaism, because essentially they think that they are the real Jews and the other Jews are wrong. All of them. So supersessionism is where one religion claims to have supplanted or finished another one and taken over its mantle. There are modern forms of Christian supersessionism, so this doesn't totally stop happening after Christianity. Mormonism is an example of a supersessionist sect of Christianity in which the modern day prophet Joseph Smith and then followed by Brigham Young take up the mantle of Christianity and they finish it according to their revelation. And so they deem themselves to be the correct form of Christianity, more correct than Orthodox or traditional Christianity. And Christianity deemed itself to be more correct than Judaism, right? So supersessionism carries with it a judgment that other forms of practice are incorrect. And this is only possible if you are monotheistic, right? That is core to what we're talking about here. Judaism established monotheism specifically so that they could reject the pantheon of other deities because they were worshiping Yahweh and they wanted to continue to do so after their defeat. It also helped them to solidify an ethnic identity around that worship. Now, Christianity, when they take up the tradition of monotheism, they also take up the implication that there is only one God and ours is it, which means the other gods are all fake or false or idols or even heretical in a sense. So this doesn't happen right away. I want to make sure we put a little asterisk next to it, but eventually this is how Christianity figures itself as the inheritor of the Jewish tradition. So that's why when we speak about the Hebrew scriptures, according to Judaism, we call them Hebrew scriptures. Christianity is what calls it the Old and New Testament. And that is because Christianity believes it has inherited the Old Testament. And then it has added its own doctrine, which includes a commentary on and interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, just like the Hebrew tradition, but their commentary and interpretation is very different from the rabbinic tradition. So that's an important distinction, very different interpretation, but still an interpretation of prior scriptures. So the authority of the New Testament is located firmly in the authority of the Hebrew scriptures, but also in the testament that the new revelation reinterprets them. Okay, so that's really important. Christianity sees itself as inheriting the claim of Judaism, and therefore all of the claims of the Jews to be the chosen people, to occupy a promised land, all of those claims and promises then get transferred in the Christian faith to the Christian practitioners, right? So now Christians see themselves as the chosen people, and various sects of Christianity will occupy that space very differently. And they also consider different spaces to be the promised land that they have the right to conquer, just like Israel or the Hebrews conquered Canaan to make themselves the nation of Israel, right? So supersession is very clear about there is one right religion and we are it, and we are the fulfillment of the prior religion. Christianity continues to this day. It does so under many different forms, including the form of supersessionism that I just mentioned, which is Mormonism. But then there's another supersession, and that is the Islamic supersession. So Islam emerges after 610 CE. We're going to have a whole week where we talk about Islam, but I just want to put it in context of supersessionism. The Prophet Muhammad positioned himself as an inheritor of the Jewish tradition, including Christianity. So the inheritor not of Christianity as it was necessarily practiced in 610, but the inheritor of a, let's say, more true Christianity, according to this tradition, more true Christianity that was in line with its Judaic origins. So it's a very different version of Christianity, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what version of Christianity that was. But they see themselves as the fulfillment, or this faith saw itself as the fulfillment of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that Muhammad was the final prophet to the monotheistic peoples of the world, specifically in fulfillment of both the prophecies of Judaism and the prophecies of Christ, who is acknowledged as a prophet in the Islamic faith. And in their form of supersessionism, yes, Islam believed itself to be supplanting both Judaism and Christianity with a final interpretation of the monotheistic scriptures and the Abrahamic tradition, however, they did this in a way that originally was supposed to inspire a certain amount of cooperation and religious tolerance among the three Abrahamic faiths. And that means that it was literally encoded into Islamic law that Christians and Jews were protected under Islamic rulers because Islam saw itself as an inheritor of these traditions. So they were to be protected and respected. That didn't last forever, and it didn't apply to people practicing religions outside of the Abrahamic tradition. So that's supersessionism. One religion supplants another because it claims to have been the final conclusion of the prior religion. They share a tradition, they share a set of scriptures. Of course, each later religion adds to the canon that they find to be sacred, and the earlier religions don't pick up the new scriptures. So yes, you have the Hebrew scriptures, and then Christianity comes along and adds the New Testament, and then Islam comes along and adds the Quran, but they also incorporate the traditions of writings from Judaism and Christianity into their faith practices. Okay? Supersession. Islam, of course, continues to this day. So all three of these faiths exist side by side, even though each one claims to have supplanted the other one. And this is just an opportunity to look at what those background images were. We have up here, this is the western wall of the old city of Jerusalem, which is the closest I can get to showing you an intact Jewish worship center in Jerusalem. And then you have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is actually a later monument than the mosque, the Dome of the Rock. But that's a complicated history that has to do with the Crusades. But what's key about all of these is that the world revolves around Jerusalem in all three of these faiths, right? It doesn't originate there. Abraham, as we already discussed, is from Babylonia, from Mesopotamia. and travels through Canaan and is promised this land, and his descendants end up in Egypt, from which they have to escape before they can come on back to the promised land. Now, Islam is differently centered on Jerusalem. It is centered on Jerusalem because of the centrality that it plays in both the Hebrew tradition, where they settle and make their kingdom around Jerusalem, and the Christian tradition, which is where Jesus is crucified. And then in Islam, they attach great importance to Jerusalem because of its legacy. But they also have a second center of their faith in Mecca. So that's another thing we'll talk more about when we get to Islam. But I just wanted to point out that Jerusalem becomes very important to all of these. And this map of the world, this is a European symbolic depiction of the world. It is not meant to be cartographic or realistic. It is meant to explain to you the relationships in the world. And we're going to have a chance to talk more about that when we talk about In the Middle of What in a couple of weeks. But the key thing that I want you to note is this is the whole world, right? It's called a TO map, which means the O is the outside, and then you have a T kind of across the middle. And this is the Mediterranean Sea in here, kind of going up into the Black and Caspian Seas here, which makes this Europe. So you're going to kind of have to tilt your head to one side to see it in the way that you're used to. And that makes this Africa. And here's the Sinai Peninsula. And that makes all of this Asia, right? Northern Asia, Southern Asia. So this is India over in here, and then East Asia. Now, what's interesting about the alignment of this map is that Eden is unreachable at the farthest eastern edge of the world in this ideology. And at the center of the world is Jerusalem. So the world turns around the gear that is Jerusalem. So that's what this says here, Jerusalem. Kives, city of Jerusalem. Right in here. And you'll notice it very much looks like a gear, a cog. So that's what's going on in the Abrahamic faiths, to which most of the Western, or with which most of the Western world is aligned. So now we're going to talk about the I don't want to say evolution, but the proliferation of disparate and intersecting faiths that are happening just east of where all of the Abrahamic faiths are really coming into being. So if we look at our map here, excuse me. So this is Iran, Arabian Peninsula. So way off to the left on this map is going to be Jerusalem. But before, or actually simultaneous with the development of Mesopotamian culture, you also have a group of folks in the Iranian and Central Asian area that are culturally much more aligned with the Indic tradition. And they kind of go up and around, and they influence European culture that way. So the Indo-Aryan tradition is rooted largely in Persia, or what is now modern day Iran, and it has links to northern India, but also into Europe. I should do that backwards. To northern India, and then up through Persia and Central Asia, which is around the Black Sea, and then into Europe. So we share a common ancestral language with India, and it's called Proto-Indo-European because PIE, because these cultures were intermingled, right? And I think we looked at that in an earlier lecture. So Old Indic religion is actually an Indo-Aryan, and it combined with the religion of the Indus Valley region, which was not exactly the same as the Indo-Aryan. So we can consider the Indo-Aryan as kind of rooting in this more Central Asian vicinity. And then we have the Indus Valley, where they have their own system of beliefs, both of which are polytheistic. And then when the two cultures really intermingle, then you get the historical Vedic religion. It's called Vedic because it is based in the Vedas, which are their scriptural texts. And that's where you start to see some of the more familiar figures and ideas of Eastern religions, which we're going to get into. But let's not get hung up on the Vedic religion, because next, what comes out of that historical Vedic religion, what comes parallel to the Vedic religion, but from the Indus Valley, is Jainism. So Jainism is one of the major world faiths that we have today, and it has a lot in common actually with the Indus Valley religion, but does not take on the Vedic pantheon. So Jainism, just quick overview. I don't want you to memorize all of this. I just want you to have a sense of what is at the core of these different religions. It is transtheistic, which means it is beyond the question of whether or not there are gods. The gods are irrelevant in this tradition. It is based on a cycle of reincarnation, and its fundamental tenets is that there is a soul, which we talked about when we talked about the history of religion, and then the principle of nonviolence, or ahimsa, which literally just means the rejection of conflict. I think my favorite explanation of ahimsa that I've ever heard is one cannot clap with one hand. So even if you have, if you have a person who wants to be involved in conflict, obviously the tattooed arm, right? That's the conflict. And the married arm. This is the conflict arm. And this is the one that can choose violence or nonviolence, right? So if the conflict arm wants to get involved, in order to create a conflict, the clap, you have to actually bring them together. However, if the non-conflict arm chooses ahimsa, then this one can flail as much as it wants, but it won't make a conflict. So that's the concept of nonviolence. It doesn't just mean that you aren't aggressive and you don't perpetrate violence. It also means that you don't push back against someone who is committing violence in order to create conflicts, like non-conflict, maybe. Another central tenet is many-sidedness, which means that any given truth has multiple angles, right? That there is no way to see the whole truth from one perspective. Another principle is non-attachment to worldly things. And the last principle is asceticism. And Jainism can be fairly extreme in its asceticism. So like fasting and denial of material goods and worldly comforts. So that's what asceticism is. So Jainism is a very old religion. It is largely practiced in a historically rooted way, even today. And Jains take 5 vows. So ahimsa, truth, non-stealing, chastity, which doesn't necessarily mean abstinence from sex. If you're a lay person and you're married, then it means fidelity, right? That you don't have additional relationships outside of your marriage relationship. And then non-possessiveness. So, right, not being greedy and accumulating for yourself. So that's the center of Jainism. And I wanted to go over this a little bit in depth because I wanted you to have a sense of what's already central to the tradition in the Asian religions before you even add in other influences, right? So even before we get the Vedas, we see something that, if you're familiar with Eastern practices at all, already looks like something we know. So Jainism continues today. And then we also have another tradition that's related, that grows out of the Vedic religion, but it intersects with Jainism because they're both part of a Sramana tradition, which just means that they follow a teacher. So the Buddha is the teacher for Buddhism, Gautama Buddha. So the Buddha, a historical figure who likely lived somewhere in northern India. I almost said Italy. That's not correct. The Buddha founded his own Sramana tradition because he became a central figure by trying out the two different paths that were available to him and finding neither of them satisfactory. So he originated somewhere in northern India in the sort of floodplain of the Ganges, but also in the foothills of the Himalayas. And his teachings very much align with what we already see in existence in this religious tradition, which is the belief in the cycle of death and rebirth, or reincarnation. And its principles include acknowledging the not self, or that the soul or the individual identity is an illusion because everything is connected. So the separateness is an illusion, let's put it that way, which means individualism and individual identity are also an illusion. Central to every practice of Buddhism are the Four Noble Truths, which include dukkha, which is suffering. Unsatisfaction is inevitable. It's everywhere in the life that we live. Samudaya, the origin of suffering is in our attachment to impermanent things, right? If having the thing makes me happy, its temporariness is what makes me unhappy, because eventually it will be gone. Nirodha, which is the cessation of suffering or the liberation from attachment. So it is possible to stop suffering, but the way to do it, the magga, is to let go of that attachment to worldly things. And that involves the Noble Eightfold Path. So that's Buddhism in a nutshell. There's a lot of caveats and nuances in the differences. We're going to look at a little bit of that very quickly. I don't want you to get too overwhelmed by what happens when Buddhism goes elsewhere. So this is the Indo-Tibetan tradition. There is also Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, and they end up in different places. Theravada ends up in Southeast Asia, and Mahayana ends up in Eastern Asia. And then in sort of that central area, that Indo-Tibetan gets mixed together with the Eastern tradition and kind of creates its own syncretist mashup. So this is a good time to talk about what is syncretism. Syncretism is when two or more religions encounter one another and they exchange ideas, and from their encounter emerges a new practice. It might be a totally new religion, or it might be a new version of one of the old religions. But the idea is that they pick up practices and beliefs from each system and then make a new version or a new spin-off of that system, and it carries forward. So the fact that there are these four major branches of Buddhism already shows you that it's syncretist, right? It emerges in India, and then it encounters other cultures and becomes a different thing. So when it moves east, it encounters Confucius and Confucianism in China. And what's important about Confucianism is that it's a philosophy, right? It's not a religious system. And so it's easy for a religion and a practice to then intermingle with a philosophy, and out of the marriage of those two to get something where nothing conflicts. So Confucianism simply sees the everyday life as sacred, right? And that we get closer to what is sacred in the world and in our life by practicing our everyday activities with intention and purpose, right? It does have some core beliefs, including that human beings are fundamentally good and that they're teachable and capable of improving, both individually and as a community, particularly by working on the self, right? That's the philosophy of Confucianism. And you can see how that would align really well with a set of beliefs that include liberation from attachment and nonviolence, right? Like those things are not at odds with one another. And so you don't have to choose between one or the other. Taoism is another major philosophy that's happening in the Far East. It's also Chinese, but it spreads well beyond China. And the Tao Te Ching is its origin, which is attributed to a person named Lao Tzu. We don't really know if Lao Tzu is a real person or not. We don't know much about Lao Tzu, but we do have copies of the Tao Te Ching. And what Taoism involves is a kind of esoteric view of the universe, of existence. So it's not strictly a philosophy or strictly a religion, but it has a worldview, or it creates a worldview that can be incorporated into either a philosophy or a religion. So the Tao is the way, and that's not the way of an individual like the path. It's the flow of the entire universe, of all of existence. And at the core of the practice of Taoism is Wu Wei, which is an ethic of non-resistance, right? Don't fight the flow of the universe. This works because they believe in autopoiesis, or natural self-organization, and that's on a micro level of organisms all the way to a macro level of the universe, and like the literal universe with the sun at the center and the planets. And human beings fall in there somewhere. They naturally self-organize. And there are 3 treasures in Taoism, which is the abstention from violence. So again, we see a concept like ahimsa, simplicity of life, which is a concept like non-possessiveness and non-attachment, and restraint from authority. So this is a different one. This is a rejection of power, right, in particular. So again, with Taoism, we can see how Buddhism, when it goes east and it encounters these philosophies and paradigms, it changes subtly, but it doesn't have to become a whole new belief system. And this is how we get the Eastern practice, or Chan Buddhism. The Japanese version of this is known as Zen, which is perhaps the most well-known term for this style of Buddhism. That's one. Then there's Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia. Theravada is a little bit different. It's less philosophical. It has the same basic teachings, but it also emphasizes the analytical method of the Buddha. And that just means that it's a little bit more of an academic form of Buddhism, but it's concerned with universal truth, not just through reason, but also through reason, but also through meditation, right? And through the emptying of the self in meditative practice as well. And this leads to a kind of mystical tradition. Mysticism is not the right word to apply here. Esoteric is. But if we think about an analogy to the Western systems and the Western faiths that we're already thinking about, mysticism is a good way of thinking that every religion has its turn towards the more abstract, right? And so that's what Theravada Buddhism really offers. And then, of course, along with that is also always your Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. And all 3 of those branches of Buddhism continue today. So that's Buddhism. We have just started on what's happening with Indian religions. You also have the Tantra tradition, which is a religious practice through bodily practices. No, a religious observance that is rooted in physical practices. Tantra does not just refer to sex, let's be clear, although that is a part of the tradition. So is yoga. This is probably the better known part of Tantra. It's also connected to some of the same teachings and philosophies that we see, that we've already seen. And in fact, the 8 limbs of yoga from Patanjali, who is a debatable authority, but he wrote the Yoga Sutras. He articulates an 8-limbed path, which has the yamas and niyamas, which is the things that you make sure to do and the things that you abstain from. And many of them line up with the principles of Jainism that we've already seen, right? Like ahimsa and truth and non-stealing and non-possessiveness. All right. So from the conglomeration of all these traditions that are existing in India at the same time, that's the Vedic, the Tantric, and the Shramana tradition, you get Smarta, which is the origin of early Hinduism, right? It's not really Hinduism proper. It's like proto-Hinduism. And what it did is it brought together 4 major schools of philosophy and practice that existed already. And that's the school of Mimamsa, or reflection. You might think of that as meditation. Advaita, which is the belief that the world is an illusion, or that separateness is an illusion. Yoga, which is spiritual practice through discipline of the body. And finally, theism, which comes with the traditional Vedic religion. So you can see how threads of the Vedic, the yogic, the Buddhist, and the Jain all kind of come together and they intermingle, and that's what creates the Smarta tradition. They have 5 major deities, and these will go on to be core to later Hindu practice. So that's Shiva, Vishnu, Surya, Ganesha, and the only female divinity here, which is Shakti. So that's the Smarta tradition, which leads us into the Hindu tradition. The biggest difference between the Smarta tradition and Brahmanism, which is what the practitioners of the religion call that religion. They don't call it Hinduism. The Brahmin tradition incorporates a priestly class. And so it gets codified, or Hindu practices get codified around very specific and elaborate traditions that are translated by a priestly class. And that continues to this day. There are many branches of Hinduism, particularly based on the deity one worships as central, we'll call it that way. But then there's also intermingling once again between Buddhism and the Brahmin tradition, and that gave us Tantric Buddhism. So that's another esoteric practice that's probably the most, if you will, mystical of Buddhist practices. And then, don't forget, in India, we also have Islam. So with, oh goodness, I've already forgotten who came before the Mughals, but there are a series of Central Asian rulers that occupy northern India in particular. Sometimes they spread out into southern India, but they have been there essentially since the Islamic Caliphate. Since Islamic Caliphate, Persia, Central Asian empires, they bring Islam into the mix. And Islam, as you know, is monotheistic. So Islam doesn't play well with other religions, but other religions don't mind playing with Islam. So Islam continues to exist, especially in Pakistan after the partition of India. There are also Muslim Indians, and that ends up being problematic. But then there are also ways in which the influence of Islam gets incorporated back into the syncretist soup that is happening in India in particular. And from that emerges Sikhism. And Sikhism is the last major religion that I'm going to articulate to you because I want you to have a sense of what other parts of the world believe in. So Sikhism is a kind of synthesis of beliefs about God. It includes some of that monotheistic impulse that they get from Islam, which is that God is creator, but also God is teacher. But it is not a traditional monotheistic religion. It is monist, which means that they believe in the oneness of existence. So some of those earlier traditions where we talked about separateness being an illusion, this becomes not just separateness is an illusion, but separateness from divinity is illusion, which means it's also panentheistic, that the divine is in everything. So a kind of complicated central deity where they don't articulate different deities because divinity is everywhere and unified. Some of the key teachings of Sikhism is that the purpose of life is to reconnect with that divine, right? That incarnation kind of makes us separate, gives us the illusion of separateness, and our job is to find the connection, particularly by overcoming the ego. And it still believes in a system of reincarnation, but now it doesn't participate in reincarnation as a path towards improvement, right? Like both Jainism and Buddhism, and I think even certain branches of Hinduism, they all believe that one's karma can dictate how one is reincarnated. In this case, because everything is one, there is no like cosmic justice that is doled out with the process of reincarnation. Instead, reincarnation is just how the new manifestation of the being that is you, that is also one with the universe. You die and your oneness gets absorbed, and then you can be reborn and your oneness is separated again, or you're separated from the oneness. I am not explaining that very well, but you're gonna have to roll with me. One of the things that is notable for in contemporary practice is that Sikhs have 6 prohibitions, and they do mark themselves, or those prohibitions do tend to mark Sikh believers as separate from the society. So they do not cut their hair, any of it, anywhere, ever in their life. This comes from a core belief in perfection, right? That one's being, one's body is a manifestation of the divine, and as such is perfect. And the altering of it is a kind of violence as well as blasphemy, right? They don't drink or do drugs. They don't gamble. They don't have a priestly class. So unlike the Brahmin tradition, they do not have an inherited priestly class. They do have people who kind of are like priests, but that's available to anybody if they perform the right education, rites, and ceremonies. And they don't eat meat that has already been sanctified for another faith, and they keep that vow of fidelity, right? No extramarital sex. So Sikhism, that is the latest. I want you to take this moment to look at the dates that we've got going on here, right? We go all the way back to like ancient Mesopotamia, right? Before ancient Mesopotamia is a thing. And then we have historical Vedic religion. That's contemporaneous with when the Jews are leaving Egypt, right? And when, let's see, the Babylonian Empire is crumbling. Then you have kind of a long jump forward. Jainism, Buddhism, Those kind of emerge at the same time. They are connected by this commitment to Shramana. Yoga and Tantra, that emerges somewhere in that same neighborhood and just a bit later, right? So Shramana and Yoga are definitely before 200, and Smarta is definitely after 200. So these are the early developments. And then we see that things just continue to develop. So Buddhism goes far in afield and it still exists today. And then Hinduism emerges out of the Smarta tradition. We have 200 BCE, before the Common Era. And now we have 300 to 500 CE. Jainism just continues on. You have a mix of the Tantric Buddhism. You have Islam, so that's in the first millennium. And then Sikhism is the latest one, and that emerges right around 1500. So Sikhism is only about 500 years old. A young religion by comparison. So this is syncretism. All of these different faiths in this region are interacting with one another. And as they do that, they take on the characteristics of each other. And that creates new and interlinked and maybe even entangled traditions. Like, it is really difficult to try and understand, let's say, all of Hinduism, because it is completely localized. Different parts of Hinduism and different practices and traditions will have different relationships to their core tenets and to their core deities. And there's just a million or more little differentiations between each practice. They have some common values, but every instantiation is different, right? So just kind of a reminder of where all of, hang on. There. So we missed the animation. There you go. All right. Just to put these back in our chart, in the places we were looking at them, right? So we had our Vedic religions earliest, and then Jainism is kind of the longest standing continuous tradition. Around the same time emerges the form of Buddhism that will become Indo-Tibetan. And then also, don't forget, you have the tantric yoga practices. Now, Buddhism branches off. In the north, it becomes this sort of Eastern version. And then in the south, it becomes the Theravada tradition. And then the tantric and Smarta traditions become Hinduism. And then emerging late in the game is Sikhism, right? So that's syncretism across Asia. And then we put that back into conversation with our supersessionist religions. So that's the major Abrahamic monotheisms. So just so you can see how things line up, right? Canaanite polytheism, Old Indic, and then we have our monolatrous Judaism around the same time as the Vedic religion. And then you start to see some of the same changes. Judaism moves towards monotheism and a rejection of other deities. And then you have both Buddhism, Jainism, and the tantric tradition, or yoga and Smarta, all emerging in roughly the same half millennium. So this, when we talked about the axial age, this is the confluence of activity that earlier historians said there must be something in the water in this moment, because all of these great philosophies are emerging at the same time. A different way of looking at this is that civilizations built around agriculture, then empire, are all experiencing similar kinds of developments over time. And the key difference here is that the supersessionist branch went the route of monotheism and the rejection of other cultures' influence, whereas the syncretistic religions went the route of incorporating and changing, organically growing as traditions and religions and becoming more complex, but also distinct and localized, right? And so these traditions are, this is not to say that they are more peaceful, because that is not the truth, but they are less likely to, how do I want to put this? They are less likely to attempt to eradicate other human beings for their belief systems, right? It's not to say that they won't try and do it, but that a lot of times the conflict that rises between syncretistic systems and supersessionist systems is that syncretist systems often, not always, can go along to get along with other belief systems, whereas supersessionist belief systems are always those people who have to be right, if that makes some sense. Like, their core belief system does not allow for the possibility that they could be wrong. And if they are right, the way that their belief system is set up implies that everyone else must be wrong, right? That's the key difference between supersession and syncretism. Well, monotheistic supersession and syncretism. So remember these guys, put those in conversation. You can clearly see that there is a singular lineage here, in a way that this is a much more complex web of legacies of different belief systems, philosophies, and practices. So that's the end of part 1. I know it's longer than we like to do it in our chunks, but it seemed really important to me that we have a better understanding of what the other belief systems are in the world in order to contextualize our understanding of the Abrahamic faiths. So the rest of this week's lectures are going to be on early Christianity and Christian syncretism. So I'm not going to promise that they're going to be shorter. I am just going to ask that you put the time in this week and know that this is going to be probably the longest lecture series for the rest of the semester. So buckle down this week. Next up, early Christianity and what is up with all of that.